In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So this is part 3 of our study on Solomon. And for the first 2 parts, we really focused on his life and what happened. Why was he known for, like, what about him, made him so wise? So those are some of the things that we focused on in the first 2 weeks. And I just want to recap kind of like 2 key points that we had. 2 key points that, from the first talk and then from the second. So when we looked at the first, our first part 1 series, we really kind of unpacked this idea of wisdom, right? And we looked at wisdom and we were asking ourselves, like, what does wisdom allow us to do, right? Why is wisdom so precious? And we broke it down into 3 things. And we said, wisdom allows us to sort through the confusion, because in our minds, like, there are competing thoughts, there's competing wills, there's so much that is happening inside of us that it can become very confusing, and we don't know exactly which way to act, right? So there's confusion. Wisdom allows us to identify what is from God and what is not from God, right? So it allows us to pierce through the confusion and then identify what is from God and what is not. But then the last part of wisdom that we really focused on was this idea that it is the kind of the execution of it. Like, once we identify God's will, then or where he's leading us, then wisdom is that final step of being able to do what God asks us to do, right? And this was a really important point that we talked about in the first one, where somebody raised a question: can it be wisdom if we don't act upon it? Like, can I just know, like, what is right or what is wrong, and then not act upon it and still say that's wisdom? And no, because wisdom, the essential part of wisdom, is the action, right? And we looked at this, example of like a high schooler who made a bad decision, and then you talk to them and they say, well, I knew I probably shouldn't have done it, right? Like, would you count that individual as being wrong? No, you wouldn't, right? Just because we know something and don't act on it doesn't equate wisdom, right? What equates wisdom is actually acting upon it, right? So that's what we really focused on with in the first week, as we unpacked wisdom. And the second one was we looked at kind of, as Solomon went through his life, there was a decline in his wisdom, right? Or maybe not a decline in his wisdom, but decline in his overall like state of being. Like, he was getting worse and worse. Started off as a good king, and then he became a poor king. And we were asking ourselves, like, well, what happened for that kind of progression? And we identified 3 pitfalls to wisdom. And we were saying that the first one is that we need to continually obey the commandments. And when Solomon received wisdom as a gift, God said, if you obey my commandments and follow my statutes, then da-da-da-da-da, right? And then he had that second warning after the dedication of the temple. And God gave him that second warning, saying, okay, you have wisdom, don't squander it. And the way not to squander it is to obey my commandments. Then the second pitfall to it was his persistent pursuits, persistent secular pursuits, right? And while Solomon spent 7 years to build, he spent 7 years to build the temple, the next sentence in 2 Kings, the first Kings, said that he spent 13 years building his own house, right? So not only did he spend that much time building his own house, but he also spent a lot of time building the houses for his wives, and then he built other houses for the gods of his wives. And so he spent a lot of time expanding the kingdom. And so so first one, First pitfall is obeying, making sure that we remember the basics, obey his command. Second one is a persistent secular suit. That becomes our, second pitfall to wisdom, because Solomon's mind was all about, well, how can I grow? How can I build? How can I do more? All right. And then the last part, which really was just another byproduct of his secular pursuits, was his untamed passion. And we saw his untamed passions with respect to all the wives that he married and all the concubines he had, and how he didn't restrain himself from anything. Whatever he wanted, he went after and he got, because he was a king and he was wise, and so he knew how to get it too. So he had untamed passions. And between those three things, Solomon had a huge decline by the time of, by the time his reign as king was up, right? And what we want to focus on today now is this, the wisdom that came out of Solomon as a result of his decline, right? So like we want to look at the pearls, like towards the end of Solomon's life. What did he learn? And what did he pass on to us? Because that's key for us, right? That's really important for us. And so one of the things I want everybody to think about right now is, what is one lesson or piece of advice you wish you would have internalized growing up? Like somebody gave you advice, and you're like, oh, that's kind of good advice, but like we kind of brushed it off, right? I want everybody to kind of highlight, like, what's a piece of advice? It could have come in Sunday school, from a parent, from a mentor, somebody you looked up to, a coach. So I want everybody to think about that. And while everybody's thinking, I just want to do a sound check. Everybody online, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
All right, great.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So, what is one lesson or piece of advice you wish you would have internalized and acted upon while growing up? All right. I will kind of open up and say, if anybody feels comfortable enough to share, because usually like when we're reflecting on a lesson that I didn't internalize, it means there's like a mistake that followed with it. All right, so if anyone is courageous enough to share, give us an opportunity. If not, I have another follow-up question. Sarah, you got your hand raised?
Yeah, Winnie, you might resonate with this one, but every couple should go to premarital counseling.
Ouch.
Ouch. But the truth hurts. The truth hurts. All right, we bear it all here at SBSS.
You said that, Abuna, and it like didn't take but like a split second.
Yes. Yes, every couple should get premarital and postmarital counseling too. Let me add to that. Right, you shouldn't wait 10 years like us to finally go and get some help. So, all right, what else? See, everybody's got mistakes.
Maybe the idea of like letting go of little things.
Oh, there's a lesson of letting go of little things. Okay. Right. I'm going to pose a second question. Why do you think it's so hard to learn from the mistakes of others? Or I could even like open it up a little bit more. It's like, okay, we have our own mistakes and we know we can, I'm venturing to say it's easier for us to learn from our own mistakes, all right? But part of wisdom is that we're looking at other people, and what we're going to look at today is at Solomon and kind of like his nuggets, his golden nuggets that he's going to pass down to us through the book of Ecclesiastes. We would hopefully learn, okay? But why do you think it's hard to learn from the mistakes of others?
I think that one factor is that we are, I think a big part of our culture is that, and take the quote unquote culture any way you want, but I would say American culture is, or maybe our generation's culture is like, be your own self, do your own thing, independence, kind of that mentality. And I think, standing apart. And so I think it's hard for us to recognize, or maybe this was my pitfall, just that, the human condition is so similar, like from one generation to the next, like, we are not so different than our fathers, than our grandfathers, than our, great, like this, there, I mean, I guess it's hitting me now. There's nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, it's just, I think it's sometimes it's hard, as a kid, especially, you kind of think like, my parents don't understand. They don't know what are they talking about? We live in a totally different generation. Things are very different now. And well, no, the human condition has been the same from, just slight variations from one generation to the next, but it's really all, we all have the same problems. They just kind of come in different shapes and sizes.
No, thank you. Good point. Why else do we think it's hard to learn from the mistakes of others?
Because you also don't get to feel the consequences of them.
So there's something special about feeling the, your own fire that you created.
Kind of to add to that, a lot of life lessons are not necessarily like action mistakes. It's also like a mindset or a way of thinking that is like corrected along with that mistake. So there's like a process like someone could go through in which they made that mistake. And those tend to be a lot more like meaningful for that person than the actual mistake, So
You're saying the process of kind of evaluating that mistake.
Yeah. Like if I got into a bar fight, for example, and I got my teeth knocked out, and I wake up in the hospital, my issue is not my first order of issue is like, how are my teeth doing? But my second order of issue is like, well, what brought me to that bar? Okay, why did I get into that fight? It's it could be indicative of something deeper, like, so, for I think for the people making the mistake, they tend to be able to synthesize all those events into like one big change that they need to make in their life. So, yeah.
When I was thinking about this question, I always put myself in the situation where I'm like, oh yeah, so-and-so screwed up, but don't worry, I won't take it that far. I'm in control.
Right, which is interesting because you don't know until you're like walking a mile in their shoes,
Yeah. Right.
It's easy to kind of be like, oh, I would never do that.
Yeah.
But you don't know what kind of pressure or what kind of circumstances that person's under. So, it could be anyone. Yeah.
So, I mean, those are some of the reasons. I'm going to pose one last question. What do you think blinds us in life from learning? What do you think blinds us from being able to learn?
If no one's going to jump on this one, like Blaise Pascal, he said that like the root of most or all, he said all, but most of humanity's problems is their inability to sit in the room alone. And I think the easy answer is like ego, like, oh, I don't, whatever. But I think the deeper answer is time with time, like alone time, and time for reflection and time for prayer and meditating, past, present, future kind of thing. Sometimes it could be pride, sometimes it simply just could be you're not carving out time to live like live in a way where you're in touch with yourself.
Thank you. Anything else? What else blinds us?
Stubbornness.
Stubbornness. Very true.
I think sometimes the people we choose to surround ourselves with,
Uh,
like we know who to go to that can like positively affirm what we're doing is right or wrong. Like
okay.
even if we do know something is wrong, we'll go to someone that might be like, no, this is fine. And then we're like really good at convincing ourselves that what we're doing is okay rather than fine.
So kind of surrounding ourselves by the wrong people to affirm what we know is wrong, but really it's what we want. That's true. That's a good one. Right. Okay. So thank you for everybody, like all the different thoughts are great. So we left, we're gonna leave First Kings because the story of Solomon ends like rather quickly. So we left it where he had gotten all these wives and entangled themselves with not just his wives and the concubines, but also their various gods. Right. So that's First Kings and right around like chapter 6 or 7, I can't remember exactly. And after that, like God like tells him like, you know, I'm going to rip the kingdom away from you, but it's not going to happen in your time because of David. And I love David. It's going to happen like afterwards. Right. And we know his son Rehoboam is after Solomon dies and Rehoboam takes charge. Rehoboam really had a little man complex, and you know his story very quickly was, you know, people came to him and said, you know, your father was really hard on us and he made us work really hard, like show us some grace, right? And to Mary's point about who we surround ourselves matters, right? He didn't know what to respond, and so he said, give me 3 days. And then he went and asked the wise men who served under Solomon, and they said, you know, yeah, Solomon worked them hard, like give them a little break, right? You'll win them over, you'll win their hearts, and they will stay with you forever. And then he went and asked like his younger people, you know, his friends, and they said, you know, you should be tough, show them that you're the big man on campus. And so he came back and he was tough, and as a result, like there was a divide in the kingdom, right? So that's a famous story for us to just kind of contextualize. But Solomon has died by this time. But before he died, like Solomon handed to us a lot of literature, right? And his literature is oozing with these pearls that he had been reflecting on because of all his experiences, right? And the biggest book that he left us is in Proverbs, right? But we're actually not going to talk about Proverbs. We're going to talk about Ecclesiastes. We're going to try and learn from Solomon through the book of Ecclesiastes, and it comes right after Proverbs. It's known in the Old Testament as part of the books, collection of books called the Books of Wisdom. And there's some interesting concepts for us to pull out from the book of Ecclesiastes, which hopefully will help us, you know, pull some of these nuggets. And the challenge is that as we pull these nuggets out, you know, is can we internalize them? Can we reflect on them with respect to our current life circumstances and our current stages in life? And then can we act? Right? Which is always, that's the kicker of wisdom. Like, can we apply it? Right? Because that's true wisdom. Because when somebody is acting in a way that is far beyond their years, okay, meaning they're a young person and they're acting with such foresight, that's the type of person that you would say, okay, there's wisdom to it, right? There's insight to it. And that's what we want to do, right? So let's try and learn from Solomon. And so we're going to start from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 3 and 5. And I apologize to everybody online. I had prepared slides, but I guess there was an update to system that I use to prepare slides, and I couldn't export them. All right, so I apologize, no slides today. I will hopefully fix it by next week. But let's look at Ecclesiastes 1, verses 3 and 5. And we're going to try and put ourselves in Solomon's shoes and understand, like, why is he saying this? Like, and why is it significant? Right? So Ecclesiastes chapter 1, 3 to 5. If somebody has it, please go ahead and read.
What profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose.
Right. So, were you everybody able to hear that online?
Yep.
Okay, great. If you guys can't hear online, like, let us know and we can always repeat something. So when we kind of reflect on these verses and knowing, like, okay, we're in Ecclesiastes, this end of Solomon's life, and he's looking back on everything that has happened, right? And he starts off with these verses of what profit has a man from all his labor, which he toils under the sun. Right? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. Right? When you think of Solomon and everything that he accomplished, and then in his memoirs, so to speak, he comes out and says, like, you know, what does a man profit from all his labor? Like, Solomon labored to accomplish what he did. Right? There was hard work to have such expansive building projects for the kingdom. Means you're in a constant state of negotiation, not just with, like, local commerce, but with other kingdoms. Like, I need lumber from you, I need limestone from you, I need, like, this from you, right? So this is what Solomon was doing. So there was a lot of labor. There's a lot of internal, you know, strife in the kingdom of, you know, how do I get my people to work? And how do I make this whole country run while we're expanding so much, right? So there's a lot of labor. What do you, like, when you see somebody who's labored this much and then comes to the end and says, like, wasn't worth it, right? And, you know, it has to make us think, right? Because all of us are laboring for something, right? We're all laboring, like, I mean, we're at a church, we have tons of students, like, everybody's laboring for something, right? We have to be asking ourselves, like, what are we laboring for? You know, and is it worth it? Because you guys are paying deeply, right? Not just financially, but with your time, your sleep, and everything, right? And there are people on the call who, like, okay, we've labored past the time of school and building our careers, you know, or we're in the season now of building our careers, and we're laboring. And for somebody to labor this much and then come back and say, careful what you labor for, right? But in what context does he give that one? Like, what is he highlighting in these verses? He's highlighting, I'll jump in here. All right, he's highlighting that there's a reality that everything in this world that we work for is going to pass away. Right? That's tough, right? Everything we work for eventually will pass away. Materially, everything we do, right? You know, we can own our practices. One day our practice will close down. You know, we can start great endeavors, and one day that endeavor comes to an end. We can plant churches in the middle of Baltimore, just like, you know, the church before us was planted, and that church came to an end. Like, everything comes to an end, right? There's a bigness to this world, right? There's a bigness to this universe, to this earth that we're on. And it's important for us to realize, it's important for us to realize that in like what we do isn't going to have much of an impact on the world. Like what did Solomon say? Like, you know, I labored, but you know what? Another generation is going to come up. And everything I labored for is going to go to that generation. And actually later on, we're not going to read it today. We're not going to cover it today, but he said, like, I don't even know who's going to come up and take everything I labored. And he could screw it all up, right? So Solomon is realizing like all his labor in the grand scheme of this world is rather insignificant, right? And when he says like under the sun, it's another way for saying like under heaven. Like he's realizing like there's heaven, which is permanent, and then there's everything underneath it, which is passing, right? Let's look at how he describes it a little bit more, and let's look at chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, right? Verses 6 and 7. He says, the wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. And the wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. So he's talking about, or what he's reinforcing, is that this idea that humanity doesn't accomplish that much. Like look at, like he's talking about the bigness of the world, right? And he's saying like all the rivers run into the sea, and yet the sea's not full. Like they make all this effort, but the sea's not full. And so he's trying to paint this picture that a lot of the efforts that we funnel our time into doesn't amount to much of any change, right? If there's no change in kind of the cycle of the world, then there's not much change or not much of a footprint that we leave based on all our efforts, right? And so it's daunting to reflect on the work that we're doing through our various organizations and our various like career paths, and to really come up and say like, is it really going to come to nothing? It's kind of a scary thought, right? Scary thought to think of like, wow, like I'm funneling all this time and energy into my career, and like eventually like I will live out my career, and then I will die, and then like what? Nothing, right? It's a scary thought, and we kind of have to hold it in tension, right? And my point is not to scare anybody out of their current program, right? But we need to be able to put appropriate context. And the reason why it's important is because, understandably so, like anybody who starts like a program or a career gets so invested that we become tunnel vision, right? And you've probably seen it, like friends or coworkers get so focused on their career that things that really matter in life fall to the wayside. Why? Because there's no bigness to this world. The only thing that is big in their mind is what I'm working towards. And that's a really dangerous place. If the only thing that is big in my life is the concept or this idea that like it's my career and what I'm doing. No. Your career is important, and we are called to work hard at what we do, but we always have to keep things in context, right? That there is something bigger than this, right? There is a world out there. There's a God out there. And we are created to work, right? He created Adam and Eve, and he said, tend and keep the garden, right? In Ephesians, it says that we're created in Christ Jesus for good works. So all of us are created to do good work, okay? And being in our respective careers and pursuits in life is really important, and it is a good work. But kind of the big question that Solomon keeps boiling everything down to is it bringing me fulfillment, right? And that's a key question. And if we're not asking that like early on in our career, then we find ourselves like year 15 or so into our career, and I've had this conversation with far too many people. I'm just like, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know what I'm working towards. And I would say most frequently, the people who ask that question, like, have been so tunnel visioned on one thing, which is themselves and their career and their pursuits. Right? I want to read a no, it's coming up, sorry. Not quite. Any questions so far? Well, I kind of just sort through my notes really quick.
I feel like going off of like the verses that we just read,
Yeah,
I also have like a different reading to
sure,
it.
go.
I almost think of it as a comforting thought.
Okay.
When he describes like that everything is that has been done is already like done, and that it will never be full, the sea is not full. And it almost just, as you said, like it makes us feel so small, and part of this bigger like purpose.
Yeah.
And I feel like that just make us loosen our grip, like a little bit around all those goals that we have.
Yeah.
That we're going in with the preconception that we are going to be like smaller than whatever those goals are, whatever that purpose is. So it almost just like, all right, like God lead the way. I don't feel the pressure that it's going to be me. No, it's going to be him.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, and also going in with the stability that none of these things that are like fluctuate up and down, it's going to really matter, like in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
So I feel like in a way this would also be.
And that's putting. I think you're taking the verse as well, because it's helping you bring context to what you're doing, right? And like what I was sharing is that when people really struggle with this, when they're so tunnel vision, right? But what you're explaining is somebody who's not tunnel vision, right? You're describing somebody who is able to kind of hold things, but hold them loosely, right? And to be able to see that there is something much greater than what I'm doing, at work. So I definitely agree with what you're saying, that we do have to see it in kind of, they're two sides of the same coin, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But that's a really good point. But when we look at like Solomon, like, and even just reflect on his life, like he was so like enmeshed in what he was doing in his pursuits, right? To the point that like, even though he had all this wisdom, like it was tearing him apart on the inside, right? What made him so wise? The literature he produces, the buildings he did, the expansion of the kingdom, all these different things made him wise. Like he was enmeshed in it. And as we're going to get into chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, we'll see like kind of what it was doing to him in his mind, right? How he was wrestling, because he wasn't finding fulfillment, right? And when we reflected last week on Solomon, one of the pitfalls was he had so many secular pursuits, right? So he was tunnel vision. And it's on the back end that he's kind of saying what you're saying, which is like, okay, well, we have to loosen a little bit. We have to know that like this will come and this will go, and like there's something bigger happening in the midst of my pursuits.
I was kind of thinking of about what you were saying in terms of like at the beginning when you talked about how like he was quote unquote wise and seeming really kind of in godly things. And I was thinking like, what's a word for that? And I think it's shrewd. Because and so I was thinking about that, and then I Googled it, the definition Webster's, and it says like that shrewd is having sharp powers of judgment, whereas wisdom is showing knowledge and good judgment. So it kind of seems like there are periods of time of Solomon's life where he's wise, and then there are periods of time of in his life where he's shrewd. Like he shows this sharp power of judgment. He's making these, by the world standards, good judgments versus, times in his life versus what he asks God for. And, where he loses his path in terms of like seeking real wisdom, making good judgment in his life, as opposed to like judgments that lead to the building of his earthly kingdom versus judgments that lead to the heavenly kingdom.
No, no, that's a great point. I think the early example in his life was like when he first married Pharaoh's daughter. Like it seemed like it was a shrewd judgment because it made sense on a national level because he was becoming an ally with a country that was a military threat, right? But it violated like the basic commands that were given to the children of Israel. So he wasn't showing good judgment, right? It was a bit of a shrewd judgment. That's a good point. All right, let's go to Ecclesiastes Chapter 2, and if somebody can read verses 1 and 2. And Ecclesiastes Chapter 2 is a pretty cool chapter because it really gives us, more insight into like what was going through Solomon's mind, like throughout his life, because he was seeking for fulfillment. Like Ecclesiastes, like he's kind of evaluating so much, and the famous phrase of Ecclesiastes is it's vanity. It's vanity, vanity, all is vanity, and it's grasping for the wind. Like what he's grasping for is like this deep fulfillment. And so he's trying to find this fulfillment. And what we're kind of reading is like, what is he learning from all the lessons in his life as far as how to find that fulfillment, right? So let's look at Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 and 2. If somebody can read that would be great. Somebody's building up the courage to read. I will say there is a word in verse 1 that I'm going to give you the definition. It's the word mirth, right? And it's joy and gladness with respect to or in the context of like festivities, right? The experience of joy and gladness in the context of festivities. So make a read verses 1 and 2.
I'll read it.
Thanks.
I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it was futility. I said of laughter, it is senseless. Sorry, my phone slept. I said of laughter, it is senseless, and of pleasure, what does this accomplish?
Right. So we get like here in verses 1 and 2, Solomon is speaking to himself, right? And he says, come now, I will test you, speaking to himself, with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. So mirth, like I'm going to test myself. It's like he's doing an experiment. Like I'm going to allow myself to enjoy like all these festivities, right? To really like live up life. Right? And then he's going to say like, well, how did I feel? Right? So he's doing his own like trial on himself. And what he came to was that it was vanity. It was pointless. I didn't find like the fulfillment I was looking for. Then he said like, well, let me just try and laugh a lot in life. Right? It's kind of interesting, but he's like, let me laugh a lot. My translation, New King James, said like madness. Like he looked at himself, he's like, this is silly. And I think the translation you read from Mina like said senseless, right? And of mirth, like this idea of like, let me just indulge. The question he's left with is like, what does that actually accomplish, right? So he's trying different things in life to say like, well, how do I find this fulfillment? How do I find what I'm looking for? And he couldn't, right? He wasn't finding any fulfillment. And interestingly, like reason alone tells us that we can't indulge ourselves in excessive fun and find fulfillment, right? We've all seen like, you know, you can probably reflect on in college, like your one friend who couldn't miss a party and now they're like the super duper senior who can't graduate, right? So reason alone tells us like we can't just indulge, right? You can't be a professional and not get your work done because you're indulging too much, right? And also at the same time, like we can't just deal with all the challenges of life in the other extreme and just kind of laugh through it, right? There's a time to laugh, but there's a time to take things seriously. So like reason alone tells us like we can't go to these extremes, right? And Solomon tried. Solomon tried to go to these extremes to say like, okay, well, can I find fulfillment here? Can I find fulfillment here? And he is striking out, right? Striking out. So what did he do next? Let's read verse 3. I'll read it. It said, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men, to do under heaven all the days of their lives. Right? This one we need to unpack a little bit. Right? I'm going to read it one more time. He says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men, to do under heaven all the days of their lives, right? So he's more or less saying, I'm doing an experiment, another one, right? And I'm trying to just take it as a case study to see like, well, what can all of humanity do, right? And that's where he's saying like, till I might see what was good for the sons of men. So he's like, let me figure it out, and then I'll pass on the wisdom to everybody else. But what is he trying to do? What is the first half of verse 3? What is Solomon trying to do?
Sorry, Abuna, what was the question again?
So my question is like, again, Solomon is on this quest for fulfillment. And so he tried kind of these two extremes in verses 1 and 2, and now he's trying another approach in verse 3. And the part that I'm asking is like, what is he actually doing when he's saying, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my heart with wisdom? What is Solomon trying to do?
Almost like a hybrid, kind of?
Okay, you're warming up.
He's like trying to live a paradoxical life. It's like he's trying to like create two different worlds.
Okay, what is he trying to create? You guys are ready? Keep going.
Like he's trying to experience it without like letting it without internalizing it almost.
Okay.
Like he's trying to get the best of both worlds without yeah, what like what
Guys, this is what all of us do, okay? All of us do this.
Yeah.
I feel like he thinks like he's invincible to the consequences of just living by gratifying the flesh.
Okay.
And he thinks that his heart is protected against whatever like pursuits that he's experimenting with.
All right. Do you guys hear that?
Can you repeat it, please?
Can you just say it one more time? You said it so loud. Raise your voice, come on.
I think he thinks that he's invincible, or like he's immune basically, and that the pursuits that he's like experimenting with won't really touch his heart or won't change it. Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Like, to put it another way, like he wants his cake and he'll have his cake and he wants to eat it too, right? So he's looking for fulfillment. So how's he trying to find it? Like, to gratify my flesh with wine, right? But not to the point where he's going to become a drunkard, right? He just wants to, like, let me ease up a little bit, let me enjoy life, let me have some wine. But I'm gonna, like, I got my wisdom hat on, so wine isn't gonna get the best of me, right? So he's kind of saying, like, wisdom is kind of telling me, like, I shouldn't dabble in this, but I'm still gonna dabble a little bit because I think there's something to be gained, right? And this is why I was saying, like, this is like all of us. Like, I mean, all of us can reflect on something where, like, we know either, like, Father confession or from church or reading the Bible, reading a book, like, I shouldn't do certain things. I shouldn't engage in certain things. But we're looking at it and we're like, but it just seems kind of like fun. And, like, it seems like other people are enjoying it, right? Is it that harmful? Or, like, so let me just try it. But you know what? I got a good head on my shoulders. I'm not going to be swept away with it. I'm just going to get a little bit of fun out of it, right? A little bit of enjoyment, a little bit of fulfillment, but I'm not going to be swept away by, whatever it is I'm putting my feet in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. There's a nice quote by Gregory of Nyssa.
Buna, your voice is echoing a lot. I wonder if the microphone is close or far to you.
It's a little bit, I mean, it's in the center of the table. Let me try and get a little bit closer. Okay, just give me a quick second. Hopefully that will take care of the echo. I'm a little bit closer.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, great. So St. Gregory of Nyssa, so he's in the 4th or 5th century, can't remember exactly. I think the 4th century. Yeah, 4th century. He says, inasmuch as we perceive the good in pleasure, any delight sets desire aflame. For pleasure is united to desire and is always attractive to each stage of our growth. Right? So I'll read it one more time. He says, inasmuch as we perceive the good in pleasure, any delight sets desire aflame. For pleasure is united to desire and is always attractive to each stage of our growth. So what St. Gregory is saying is that, we can look at different things that, other people are engaging in and say, like, like, there's something good in there. Like, I can enjoy it, right? I can take pleasure in it. But he's saying we need to be careful because any delight sets our desire aflame. And when we're kind of looking and saying, like, or at least Solomon is saying, like, well, let me dabble in this wine, but don't worry, like, wisdom is going to guide my heart. He's essentially saying, like, I'm not going to let my desire become a flame, right? But that's like the best trick of the devil, right? He always lets us dabble a little bit and says, like, oh, there's good in here, there's some enjoyment here, but you're a good person and you go to church and you read the Bible and, like, you're not going to be swept away, right? But what that is like, he's just, like, kind of getting our desire going. And when we reflect back on Solomon, his last pitfall was untamed passions, right? That's really what brought him down when he got entangled with so many different women and wives and concubines. Like, it tore him apart because there was, good, and there's, like, a bit of good in what he was trying to do, but the way he did it was very bad. and it lit his desire, and it became a burning furnace inside of him, and he couldn't control it, right? So this is what Solomon is trying to do, right? In order to find that fulfillment. He's trying to say, like, let me just strike a good balance. All right. And so as he's doing this, I'll read, I want to read 4 through 10, right? And I want to wrap up soon. It says, I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had great possessions of herds and flocks and all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasure of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor, right? So what Solomon is saying, especially at the end, like he goes through all the different things that he has done, but at the end, he's just like, I have a right to enjoy. Like I worked really hard. We produced all these, different things. Like there was such a surplus. I deserve this ability to enjoy, right? And so he didn't withhold anything. He worked hard, but he played hard, and he played almost even harder, right? But what did that lead to? Let's look at verse 11. Then I looked on all the works of my hands. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I toiled. And indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Right? This was the sad, realization of Solomon. Is like, I worked really hard, and I tried to enjoy myself because I worked really hard, hoping that, because I worked hard, my time of enjoyment was going to, be fulfilling. But again, at the end, it was nothing, right? I was kind of just feeding myself this whole time, which is like what vanity is. It's this like inflated self perception of the self, right? And he's realizing like, well, if I work hard and then I play hard, essentially I'm just feeding my own ego. And there's no fulfillment in that. Read a quote by St. John Chrysostom. He says, there was no one who lived in greater luxury or higher glory. There was no one so wise or so powerful, no one who saw all things so succeeding to his heart's desire. What then? He had no enjoyment from all these things. What after all does he say of it? Say of it himself, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Right? So St. John Chrysostom is just commenting and saying like, Solomon got nothing from everything that he did. And it's such a sad like situation to be in. Like when you think of like, the life that he lived, what he was known for, all these different like almost mind games that he played with himself in order to find fulfillment. And then at the end, he's just like, I just can't find it. Right? It's a really sad state to be in. And this is why like it's really important for us to look at ourselves and to look at Solomon and to reflect on Solomon and to say like, wow, I don't want to be like this. Right? I want to have the wisdom in order to sort through the confusion, figure out what is of God and what is not of God, and then actually execute it. Like I need that in my life. And that is going to point me towards fulfillment. Solomon had it, but he didn't he lost the execution step. Right? But so that we don't end on such like a negative tone, all right? We're gonna skip all the way to the end of Ecclesiastes because Solomon has like 2 good verses at the very end in chapter 12, which you know, we're going to end on, which is, you know, kind of his like, okay, summation. Like, okay, Solomon, like put it all together and tell us what do we got to do, right? You told us not to laugh. You told us not to drink. You told us not to like labor so much. So give us something to do. All right. So if we go to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, we'll read verses 13 and 14. All right. And it says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. All right. And it almost just seems like really like all this, and you want to tell us just like follow the commandments? Like that's your summation. But if we kind of unpack it a little bit, I think we'll find like a good nugget in there. Because what he's really pointing to is that fulfillment comes relationally, right? Fulfillment comes through relationships, not like through possessions or actions or different things we participate in, but fulfillment really comes through a relationship. And what he's pointing at is a relationship with God. And St. John Chrysostom, kind of the continuation of the quote that I started reading, he says this, let us believe him and lay hold on that in which there is no vanity, in which there is truth, and what is based upon a solid rock, where there is no old age or decline, but all things bloom and flourish, without decay or waxing old or approaching dissolution. Let us, I beseech you, love God with genuine affection, not from fear of hell, but from desire of the kingdom. For what is comparable to seeing Christ? Surely nothing. What to the enjoyment of those good things? Surely nothing. Well, may there be nothing comparable, for eye has not seen nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. Right? So Solomon is really coming to that, like at the end, what he missed out of his wisdom was this relationship with God. And when we kind of reflect back on kind of, you know, after he had married so many wives and all these gods have entered into the kingdom and really creating a confusing state for Solomon, scripture describes it as his heart was torn away from God, right? And it's right there that his pursuit for fulfillment, it just, he comes up empty. Why? Because it's pulled away. And fulfillment comes relationally. And what St. John Chrysostom was saying, like in this relationship that we pursue after with God, it's based on something that doesn't decay. It's based on truth. It's based on, there's so many great things that he was saying, like, but it's based on something that can't like fizzle away. Why? Because it is infinite. Notice how like in Solomon's pursuit, right? He almost went to extremes, like extreme of partying, extreme of laughing, not there, right? Extreme in his pursuits and his secular pursuits, no fulfillment is there. But when you take that idea of that persistent pursuit and then you apply it to the person of Christ, there is never a time where we reach the end, right? There's no experiment, you know, it's not experimental. Like we will continue to, you know, unite with him, pursue after him, and the depth of fulfillment is endless. And so relationally is where we find fulfillment. First in our relationship with God, but then also in our relationship with you know, family and spouses and children and friends. Like it's through these relationships that we ultimately find fulfillment. Right? And notice how when you compare David and Solomon, how was David? We know that Solomon was always referred to as the wisest king. David was the greatest king, but how do we always refer to David? How's he frequently referred to?
And
man
after God's heart.
after God's own heart, right? That's a relationship, right? And that's what made David the greatest king, right? Because he was a man after God's own heart. One of the greatest challenges that we have is to identify how God is continually reshaping us in our current circumstances, right? And what I mean by that is that, something you said at the beginning, Christine, is like when we're first reflecting on the first couple of verses on how it challenges us to hold things loose, right? And one of the ways, or one of the benefits of learning to hold things loose is that, when we're in the fire of certain circumstances and challenges, right? If we're holding too tight, right, onto whatever it is we're pursuing, or whatever's at the end of this challenge, right? We may miss what God is like doing inside of us, the good work. And sometimes the good work that He is doing inside of us requires us to miss out on what we maybe want to hold on to, right? We need to lose something. We need to feel that disappointment. We need to feel like that, it's okay if I let this go because, I'm not going to violate this value that I have, right? And when we kind of face those struggles in life, and when we face those situations, like that becomes very formative for us. When we're working for something, but all of a sudden, like a wrench is thrown into the situation, and it's going to require us to either compromise our morals, do something that we shouldn't be doing, or just simply like give up either our spiritual practices, our time in church, like my pursuit after God, like, and we begin to weigh all these things and say, no, like I'm not going to pursue after this, because this thing in and of itself cannot give me fulfillment. What is going to give me fulfillment comes in my relationship with God, right? And my relationship with God is formed and molded by my struggle to adhere to the different values that He's given to me in the circumstances, right? But we have to be able to let go in order to actually hold on to God in the process. So it's important for us to just kind of like end with this thought, is that true fulfillment is going to come relationally, not through circumstances, not through pursuits, but through relationship with God. And that's what we need to protect. And that's what Solomon didn't protect. And that's why he grieved. Any thoughts or questions before we close up? Let's close in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for your blessings for this day and for your servant Solomon. And we pray, Lord, that you would allow us to learn from him, to take in these lessons from his life, and to look at our own, and to not compromise when it comes to our relationship with you. Lord, we end up in so many circumstances in life wondering like what we're doing and why we're here and what's going on. And when we're there, we can be assured that we've missed our relationship with you. We've missed connecting with you. So Lord, help us to reconnect, to prioritize our time with you, and to know that the struggle that we face is worth it, and give us the strength to make the right decisions, to not sacrifice our communion with you. Through the intercessions of all your saints, hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. So next week we are going to start studying the book of Tobit, but I want to, before we actually study the book of Tobit, what I want to do is do 1 week on kind of understanding where do these additional books come from in the Old Testament, which we talk about or refer to as sometimes the deuterocanonical books or the apocryphal books. So we'll take next week to kind of talk about that, and then we will go into Tobit the week after. Okay.